The morning Hazel Merritt turned 17, the first frost came early to Duskwater, Idaho, pressing itself against the cabin windows like something that had been waiting all summer for permission to arrive. She noticed it before she noticed anything else, the way the light came through the glass thicker than usual, the way her breath showed even inside the kitchen. The stove had gone cold overnight. Nobody had fed it. She dressed in the dark the way she always did, layering wool over cotton, tucking the shirt tight before pulling on her boots. The floor creaked in the same three places it always had, and she moved around them from memory, careful the way people get careful when they've spent years learning not to disturb the quiet of a house that no longer wanted noise. Cecily was already awake. Hazel could hear the small sounds from the far side of the partition wall, the deliberate placement of a cup, the controlled exhale of a woman who made even breathing feel like a decision. Cecily Merritt was not the kind of person who slept through discomfort. She was the kind who rose before it and waited. Hazel stepped outside to bring in wood before the household needed it. The sky above the ridge was the color of a bruise healing wrong gray, bleeding into a yellow that promised nothing good. The woodpile was low. She had been the one keeping it stacked for the past 18 months, hauling birch and pine from the shed in armloads, splitting the larger pieces herself with the maul that had been her father's. She knew the weight of the handle the way she knew the distance from the cabin to the creek by the body, not by thought. Gareth Merritt had been a man who measured everything that way. The right amount of tension in a harness strap. The exact pitch of an axle that needed grease. He ran freight across the northern Idaho valleys for 12 years, crossing the Clearwater tributaries in spring, when the banks ran brown with melt hauling goods to settlements small enough that their names only appeared on the hand-drawn maps kept in the back offices of supply companies. His word had weight in Duskwater the way timber had weight, dense, reliable, something people built against. When the cottonwood fell across his wagon during the crossing in the spring of 1882, he did not survive to see the water clear. Nobody did anything wrong. The bank was undercut from the snowmelt. The tree had been leaning for a decade without anyone noticing. A freighter who'd made that crossing 40 times met the 41st one differently. Hazel was 15 when it happened, standing outside the trading post, watching the clouds move in from the north, and she felt something shift before the rider came in with the news, as though the air itself had changed composition. 18 months is long enough to understand that grief doesn't end. It reorganizes. Inside the cabin, the reorganization had been quiet and total. Cecily had not fallen apart after Gareth's death. Falling apart required a certain softness, a willingness to let the seams show, and Cecily Merritt had sealed every seam years before the marriage, perhaps years before she'd even arrived in Idaho. She was a practical woman in the way the territory required, capable of preserving meat, managing accounts, making decisions without flinching. She'd come to Gareth already widowed, already careful, already finished with the version of herself that believed good fortune was owed to anyone. What she could not manage, and what she had never said aloud, was the particular cruelty of watching Hazel grow. The girl had her father's way of standing. That quiet assessment before speaking, the habit of looking slightly past a person's shoulder before meeting their eyes, as though checking the room for information before engaging. She had his coloring, too dark hair, and the kind of skin that caught sun and held it into winter. Every month that passed, the resemblance sharpened. Cecily would look up from the table and for half a second see Gareth in the doorway, and then the moment would collapse, and what remained was a 17-year-old girl who was not her daughter and not her problem, and not, as far as the law in Duskwater cared, her responsibility at all. The silver bracelet lived on the narrow shelf above the stove. Gareth had worn it on his left wrist for as long as Hazel could remember. A simple band, nothing ornate, with his initials pressed into the inside face in small, deliberate letters, GM. He'd taken it off the day before the crossing to keep it from snagging in the harness, which meant it was home when he wasn't, and it was what remained when he couldn't. Cecily had moved it to the shelf the week after the funeral and had not touched it since, though she tracked its position every morning the way some people track the weather, unconsciously, constantly, as a form of orientation. The morning it disappeared, Hazel was behind the cabin splitting wood. She heard the sound of the shelf being dragged across the wall from 50 feet away, that particular scrape of wood on wood that meant something was being searched for and not found. Then the silence that followed was different from the usual silence, charged in a way that made the back of her neck prickle even before she registered what it meant. By the time she came around the corner of the cabin with an armload of split pine, Cecily was standing in the doorway with a look that Hazel had learned to read the way she'd learned to read weather, not from what it showed, but from what it withheld. The bracelet was gone. The searching had already happened and already failed. What remained was the stage after failure when a person needs somewhere to place the wreckage. There was no evidence, there were no witnesses. There was only the mathematics of proximity, who had been in the house, who had access to the shelf, who was the easiest available answer to a question that nobody actually wanted investigated too closely. Cecily's eyes moved over Hazel the way a person looks at a locked door they've already decided is hiding something. The accusation didn't come as a question. It came as a conclusion delivered with the quiet certainty of a woman who had already tried grief and silence and patience and found them all insufficient. Hazel said she hadn't taken it. Her voice was level. She'd learned early that raising a voice in this house accomplished nothing except making the walls feel smaller. She said she hadn't touched the shelf in 3 days, that she hadn't been inside that morning, until now that the bracelet had been there yesterday when she filled the stove because she'd seen it while reaching for the damper handle. None of it mattered. Cecily stepped closer, close enough that Hazel could see the fine lines around her mouth deepen, the way they did when she was keeping something contained. Looking like your father doesn't make you half the man he was. The words came out measured and soft, which made them worse than shouting. They landed in the specific way that only the right cruelty can land, surgical aimed, finding the exact place where something was still unguarded. The room went absolutely still. The fire in the stove had nothing to say. The windows had nothing to offer. Hazel stood with the split pine still in her arms and felt something close in the back of her throat that she refused to let open. She went back to the woodpile. Splitting wood is useful when you cannot speak. The mall is honest in a way that conversation rarely is. It requires your full attention and returns something real, smaller pieces. A task completed a pile that grows. Hazel worked through the afternoon with a focus that was not calm, but performed as calm. Each swing measured each piece, stacked with the same care she gave to everything in that house that she knew she would eventually have to leave behind. She had known this moment was coming. Not today, not necessarily in this exact shape, but the shape of it had been visible for months in the way steam is visible before water boils. The cabin had been dying since the day Gareth didn't come home from the crossing. What they'd been doing in the 18 months since was inhabiting the space between when the death happened and when everyone finally admitted it. The sun had dropped below the western ridge by the time she came around to the front of the cabin. The canvas sack was sitting beside the door. It was one of the old freight bags from the supply run, sturdy enough with a strap worn smooth from years of use. Someone had packed it with care, or with the specific economy of a person who wants to be thorough without being generous. Hazel stood on the threshold looking at it for a long moment before she picked it up. The weight told her something before she looked inside. Not heavy enough to be cruelty, not light enough to be abandonment. Somewhere in between, which is exactly where Cecily Merritt lived. Inside, half a loaf of cornbread wrapped in a cloth still faintly warm. A wool sweater, the dark green one with the mended elbow, which had been Gareth's, and which Hazel had been wearing through cold mornings for a year. A belt knife with a bone handle, the one that had lived on the hook by the door since before Hazel could remember Gareth's daily knife, the working one, not decorative, worn at the edge from years of genuine use. She reached to the bottom of the bag. Her fingers found metal before her mind caught up. She lifted it into the gray light of late afternoon. The silver bracelet GM pressed into the inside face, worn smooth at the curve where Gareth's wrist had rested against it for years. It sat in her palm and said nothing, which was more than anyone inside the cabin had offered all day. Cecily had put it in the bag herself. The bracelet had never been missing. It had been placed there at the bottom, beneath the bread, beneath the sweater, beneath the knife, as though it needed to be found after everything else. Hazel did not understand it. She stood on the threshold of a house that had stopped being home somewhere around the time she was 15 and tried to work out what the bracelet meant, what the gesture was supposed to communicate, whether it was an apology or a confession or something else entirely that didn't have a clean name. The door behind her was closed. She had not heard it close, which meant it had been eased shut deliberately, quietly, by someone who did not want to witness the moment of finding. There was nothing to say to a closed door. There was nothing to say at all. She put the bracelet in the inside pocket of her coat against her chest, where it would stay warm. The dog appeared from around the far corner of the cabin before she'd taken 3 steps. Cinder all black except for a pale smudge above his left eye, moving with the loose-shouldered trot of a dog who had already decided where this was going. He fell into step beside her without being called, and she didn't call him, and neither of them looked back as they crossed the yard and entered the tree line. Duskwater shrank behind her the way things shrink when you walk away from them in October quickly, as though it had never wanted to be large. The trading post, the smithy, the 3 or 4 main structures that gave the settlement its nominal weight, all of it reduced to a gap in the timber within a quarter-mile. She had grown up in that gap, had learned its dimensions so thoroughly that her body still moved as though avoiding furniture that no longer existed. She didn't think about it. She thought about the ground in front of her, the way the light was falling at an angle that would last another 2 hours before the sky closed down for good. The small things that required management before darkness made them harder. Old Fletcher Vane had taught her that. Not the specific lesson, think about the ground in front of you. Think about the 2 hours of light, but the approach, the habit of attention that organizes experience into something useful rather than something overwhelming. Fletcher had lived 3 miles west of Duskwater, near a stretch of black marsh that nobody else wanted, in a cabin that looked like an accident from the outside and ran with extraordinary efficiency within. He was somewhere past 60 when Hazel's father died, and he had appeared one afternoon about 3 weeks after the funeral. Not to condole, not to bring food the way neighbors did, but to show Hazel how to read the wind by watching the motion at the topmost point of the tallest trees. Not the lower branches, which were easily confused by local turbulence, but the very tips which told you what the air was actually doing. She had not expected to find that useful. She had found it indispensable. Over the following year, Fletcher pulled her out of the particular inertia of grief by giving her problems that required specific physical solutions. How standing deadwood burns hotter than green timber because the moisture has already been surrendered. How the underside of a pine's lowest branches tells you whether that spot floods in spring. How the space between a fire and a good windbreak matters more than the size of the fire. How smoke travels at night in ways it doesn't during the day, and what that means for anyone who doesn't want to be found. He gave her the wooden owl on a Tuesday in late September, the year after Gareth died. It was small, carved from a piece of pine with the grain running lengthwise so it would hold the detail. The wings folded tight, the head turned slightly as though listening. He put it in her hand without explanation, and then explained anyway, because Fletcher was not actually a man who withheld. Some people look at a tree and see nothing but firewood. Others see a place to survive the winter. He said it softly with the tone of a man who had spent enough winters to find the distinction genuinely significant. The following December, the cold that settled over the northern Idaho valleys was not unusual in temperature, but unusual in duration, the kind of sustained, deep cold that finds everything that was poorly made and disassembles it. Fletcher Vane's heart was poorly made, or had become so, and the cold found it. He was gone before anyone could have done anything, and Hazel was left with the owl in her pocket and a year's worth of lessons that would take the rest of her life to fully understand. She kept walking. The creek found her more than she found it. The sound preceding the water by several seconds, the air changing character near the banks, the way it always did, colder, sharper, carrying the mineral smell of moving water over stone. She followed it north and slightly east, which was the direction of higher ground, which was the direction of less travel and less likelihood of encounter, which was what Fletcher's lessons pointed toward when you needed to move without being tracked. The first night she slept under the spread of a blue spruce whose lowest branches swept the ground in a wide skirt, leaving a space inside that was almost entirely windless. She broke no branches left, no fire ate a small piece of the cornbread, and gave Cinder nothing because there was nothing suitable yet, and he curled against her back through the coldest hours of the night with the practical devotion of a dog who has decided that this is simply where he lives now. She did not sleep well. She didn't expect to. The second day moved through country she knew loosely from years of listening to Fletcher describe the terrain north of Duskwater, the way the ridgelines ran, the places where the hillsides caught snow earlier than the valleys. The creek's tendency to split around a limestone shelf about 4 miles in before rejoining itself downstream. She found the shelf and used it to cross without getting her boots wet, which was a victory small enough to feel almost embarrassing, but she counted it anyway. Fletcher had told her that in difficult stretches, accounting for small successes kept the mathematics honest. Cinder ranged ahead of her during the daylight hours, disappearing into the timber, and returning a few minutes later, his behavior unchanged, which was its own kind of information. Nothing ahead that warranted alarm, nothing that required her to change speed or direction. She had traveled with him enough to know his signals. A slightly higher head carriage meant something interesting. A return that was faster than usual meant something worth knowing. He came back at his ordinary pace all through the second day, and she moved at hers. The cold held steady. Not the brutal cold of midwinter, but the patient cold of early October at elevation, the kind that doesn't threaten your life with immediate urgency, but keeps a running account of every mistake, every moment of inadequate shelter, every hour of insufficient caloric intake, storing them up the way a creditor stores debt against the day when it will be inconvenient for you to pay. She found shelter that night in a natural depression between two root masses where a tree had fallen years before, the root ball large enough to block the northwest wind, the fallen trunk a secondary barrier. She built a fire small enough to be almost nothing, just enough to take the edge off, just enough to boil the water she gathered upstream in the tin cup that had been in the freight bag's outer pocket, which she hadn't noticed until an hour after leaving Duskwater. Another small accounting, another thing in her favor. Wolves announced themselves from the far side of the eastern ridge sometime around midnight. Not close, not approaching, just marking their presence in the specific declarative way wolves have, as though the landscape belongs to them, and they are simply noting the current inventory. Hazel lay awake, listening until they moved off, and then lay awake for a while longer in the silence that followed, which was heavier than the sound had been. The third night was the one that nearly broke the arithmetic. The temperature dropped faster than she'd anticipated, the bottom falling out of the evening within an hour of sunset. Her best shelter option was another dense spruce lower than ideal, and by the time she'd eaten the last of the cornbread and settled in with Cinder pressed tight against her, the cold had already taken her left foot from warm to numb, to the unsettling territory past numb, where you stop feeling what you should be feeling. She spent the night performing small movements, flexing what she could, staying just active enough to maintain the minimum. Cinder woke twice as if he'd felt her shift, and each time moved more fully against her, redistributing his warmth without being asked. When daylight finally appeared, it was the specific gray of a promise that isn't quite a promise, enough light to move, not enough to call it morning. They were both stiff. She worked her foot in her boot until sensation returned with the unpleasant vindictiveness that returning circulation always brought. And then she stood, and then they moved. By mid-morning of the fourth day, the cornbread was gone. The last of it had been the previous night, and its absence was a fact that changed the nature of what she was doing. Until now, she had been putting distance between herself and Duskwater. Distance alone was not a plan. A person could not move indefinitely through northern Idaho wilderness in October on an empty stomach and expect winter to be impressed. The creek had widened slightly. She was higher now, the terrain rougher, the open ground between the timber patches sheeted with thin ice that cracked under her boots with a sound too loud for the silence around it. She was working through the calculation, 2 days remaining on anything like safe forage, the question of where she was actually going, when Cinder stopped. Not the stopping of a dog who hears something, not the stopping of a dog who smells something interesting, the stopping of a dog who has made a decision. He turned off the trail they'd been following, a narrow game path that traced the creek's eastern bank, and moved perpendicular to it into the timber with a deliberateness that was nothing like his usual exploratory ranging. She followed because she had been following his instincts for 2 days, and they had not been wrong, and because Fletcher had been specific about this, not the instinct of the human who has been walking too long and whose judgment is beginning to blur at the edges, but the instinct of an animal who has not been impaired by abstraction. The ground sloped down between two parallel ridgelines, creating a hollow that the wind would pass over rather than through. She could feel it immediately, the particular stillness of sheltered air, the way temperature behaved differently when it was not being stolen by moving currents. Deer tracks crossed in the fresh dusting of snow, multiple animals unhurried. Rabbit prints arced toward a cluster of underbrush and disappeared. This was a place animals returned to, which meant it provided something, which meant it had been evaluated against alternatives and found superior, which was exactly the kind of reasoning Fletcher had told her to borrow when her own resources were running thin. Cinder had disappeared into a cluster of young aspens on the far side of the hollow, their white trunks bare and almost luminous against the dark timber behind them. She could hear him moving, but not see him, and then she couldn't hear him either, and then she stepped through the aspens and stopped. The cottonwood was enormous in the way that things are enormous when they have been growing quietly for longer than anyone has been watching. The trunk rose from the frozen ground with a circumference that made her own scale suddenly irrelevant. It was the width of a room, the width of something that had been standing here while the territory was still a territory, while her father was still alive, while Fletcher Vane was still young. It had died standing, the bark gone gray, and checked with age, the upper branches bare against the sky. But it had not fallen. Whatever had kept it standing through decades of Idaho winters had kept it standing still. The opening was on the south face, a dark gap in the wood, irregular at the edges, but tall enough that she would not need to stoop, wide enough that she could enter without turning sideways. The cold moved around the outside of the trunk in small, organized currents, but at the opening's edge, the movement stopped. The air just inside was still. She put one hand on the handle of the knife at her belt, the other palm flat against the outer wood of the trunk, feeling the grain of it dead and dry and solid. Then she stepped inside. Cinder was sitting in the far end of the space with the comfortable arrangement of a dog who has already assessed the room and found it acceptable. The interior was larger than the exterior had any right to suggest. The hollow had been widened by whatever process of internal decay had emptied the tree while leaving its outer shell intact, and the result was a chamber that ran deeper than it ran wide, with a ceiling that rose above her head by several feet at the center. A crack in the wood near the top admitted a thin shaft of pale light that moved slightly as the outside air moved the upper structure, throwing a slow diagonal across the floor. The floor itself was covered in years of accumulated debris, leaf fall, wood dust, the remnants of whatever had sheltered here before her. But beneath it, she could feel with the toe of her boot was solid ground, elevated slightly from the surrounding terrain. She turned slowly, taking inventory. South-facing entrance away from the predominant winter winds. Thick walls of ancient dry wood on every side, better insulating than anything she could have built. A height that would hold warm air near the living level. A crack at the top that could serve as a smoke outlet if managed correctly. Most people looking into a hollow dead tree in October would see somewhere to wait out a single bad night. Hazel Merritt stood in the semi-dark and felt something she hadn't felt since the spring of 1882. Since the last morning she'd watched her father walk across the yard toward the barn before heading to the crossing. The specific quality of a place where continuation seemed not only possible, but probable. She might actually survive the winter. The thought arrived quietly without ceremony, the way the most important realizations tend to arrive, not announced, not dramatized, but present, solid, taking up exactly the amount of space it deserved. She turned it over once, the way you turn over something found on the ground to check its underside to make sure it is what it appears to be. It held. Outside, the gray sky of mid-October pressed down on the northern Idaho hills with the particular patience of a season that knows it has months ahead of it and is not in any hurry. The creek moved on the far side of the hollow with the sound of water that would be ice in a few weeks. The aspens at the edge of the depression held their bare branches against the sky with the stripped-down dignity of things that have surrendered what they couldn't keep and are waiting for what comes next. Hazel pulled her coat tighter. Not from cold, the interior was already noticeably warmer than the air outside, but from the impulse toward deliberateness that seized her when a decision solidified. She had the knife. She had the bracelet pressed against her chest. She had Cinder, who was now lying down with his chin on his paws, breathing the slow breath of an animal that has arrived where it intended to go. She had the owl in her pocket and the lessons it stood for, and everything Fletcher had given her that she hadn't yet been asked to use. She set the canvas bag down against the interior wall. Then she started to learn the dimensions of what was going to have to be enough. The first thing she cleared was the debris nearest the entrance, because that was where cold air pooled when the wind shifted, and because starting at the edges was how you learned the dimensions of a problem before committing to a solution. She used a flat piece of bark pulled from the interior wall as a shovel, scraping years of accumulated leaf fall toward the opening in long, deliberate strokes. The material came up in layers, each one a different season. The most recent still holding some color, the oldest compressed into something closer to soil than vegetable matter. What was dry enough to burn went into a pile against the right wall. Everything else she dragged outside by the armload, spreading it around the base of the cottonwood, where it could insulate the roots without stealing floor space from the living area. The work took 2 full days. By the end of the second day, the floor of the hollow was exposed, Compacted earth mixed with fine wood dust, slightly elevated from the outside grade, with no visible signs of water intrusion along the walls. She covered the dampest-looking sections with layers of dried grass, pulled from the south-facing hillside above the hollow, then added a layer of bark strips pulled thin and flat. The result was not warm underfoot, but it was dry, which in October in northern Idaho was the more important quality. She organized the interior the way her father had organized his freight wagons, not by what was heaviest or most valuable, but by what she would need to reach fastest under the worst conditions. Sleeping area at the far rear wall away from the entrance, with the green wool sweater rolled as a pillow and the canvas bag folded beneath her hips to keep the ground's cold from rising through. Firewood stacked in tight rows along the left wall, close enough to feed the fire, without crossing the floor in the dark, far enough from the wall to allow air circulation that would keep it from taking on moisture. The right corner for food tools, anything requiring the most careful preservation. Cinder inspected each arrangement with his nose, accepted them with the pragmatic indifference of a dog whose standards are comfort and warmth rather than aesthetics, then settled in the sleeping area with the proprietary confidence of an animal who knows it has already been decided. On the third morning inside the cottonwood, Hazel walked the perimeter of the hollow twice, looking for a suitable piece of wood for the record board. Fletcher had never called it that. He'd never used the phrase at all. But the concept came from him, from the way he kept his own observations. He'd shown her his notes once, a collection of small papers covered in his cramped handwriting. Temperatures, snowfall estimates, firewood consumption per day at different cold thresholds. The dates of first and last frost over 15 years. Memory is generous with what it keeps, he'd told her, turning the pages slowly, but it has a particular talent for losing exactly what you'll need most in February. She found a plank of fallen cottonwood limb near the base of the tree, weathered but solid, its surface smooth enough to take charcoal marks without too much resistance. A burned stick from the debris pile served as the first pencil. She carried both inside, set the plank against the wall where the thin light from the upper crack fell across it. At the best angle, drew a line across the top and wrote the date beneath it in the careful block letters her father had insisted she practice until they were legible under fatigue. Then she wrote 2 words above the date, day 1. The decision was small enough to fit in 2 words. What it committed her to was considerably larger. She spent the next 3 days improving what she had driven by the particular economy of someone who understands that the window for preparation closes before you can see it closing. The entrance needed a wind barrier before the temperatures dropped another 10 degrees. She collected young willow shoots from the frozen creek bank a quarter-mile southeast, hauling them back in bundles that she stacked inside the entrance overnight to let them warm enough to work without snapping. She wove the first door panel the following morning, lashing the frame together with strips of root fiber she'd soaked until pliable. The result looked capable. She checked the lashing at each junction, tested the fit against the entrance frame, and felt the reasonable satisfaction of something made with care. That night the wind came from the northwest. She heard the first gusts in the upper branches of the surrounding timber, a rising collective hiss that built over 20 minutes into a sustained roar. The cottonwood itself barely moved. Its mass was too great for the kind of wind that strips smaller trees. But the willow panel was not a cottonwood. The gusts found the entrance with the impersonal efficiency of air, moving through the path of least resistance, built pressure against the woven surface, found the weakest junction in the lashing, exploited it, and finished the job in a single concentrated burst sometime before midnight. She woke to cold air moving across her face with no barrier between it and the entrance. The panel was gone. The temperature inside had already dropped 4 degrees by her best estimate. Not dangerous yet, but the direction of the drop was information. She lay still for a moment, accounting. Then she got up, rebuilt the fire from the coal bed she'd been maintaining, fed Cinder the last of the smoked rabbit scraps from the previous day, sat down with the record board, wrote the date and the temperature estimate, and 4 words beneath them: door failed, redesign required. She went out at first light to find the panel. It was 8 feet from the entrance, half buried in new snow, one side of the frame bent where it had struck a root on impact. She carried it back inside not to reuse it, but to study the failure, which junction had given first, which lashing material had proven insufficient, where the design had assumed cooperation from conditions that hadn't offered any. The gust always finds what the eye forgets. She wasn't certain whether she was remembering Fletcher's exact phrasing or her own version of it, but the meaning was the same either way, pressed into her by the sight of the bent frame in her hands. The second door took 4 days. She cut wooden stakes from a deadfall birch she found on the ridge above the hollow, shaping them to points with the belt knife, driving them into the frozen ground at the base of the entrance frame, with a river stone used as a hammer. The frame itself was heavier this time, lashed with strips of deer hide she'd cut from the skin of the first rabbit, too small for the whole panel, so she supplemented with the wax-treated cord from the supply bag's repair kit, doubled at every junction. The locking bar was a single piece of birch rod that dropped into two notched uprights from the inside, simple enough to operate in the dark with cold hands, secure enough that opening it required intention rather than accident. She tested it 6 times before trusting it. The trap lines went out on the 8th day. She set them along the game trails she'd mapped during her initial survey of the hollow's surroundings, the northeast path that the rabbit prints followed most consistently, the depressions south of the aspens where the snow was packed hard from repeated overnight use, the brushy area along the creek's second bend where the squirrel sign was concentrated. The snares were willow loop constructions set at the height and angle Fletcher had specified for cottontails, with a small horizontal twig across the opening to keep the loop vertical. The deadfall traps were simpler, a flat stone balanced on a notched trigger stick, baited with dried grass seed from the hillside above. Cinder proved useful in a way she hadn't anticipated and couldn't have planned for. Each morning when she went to check the lines, he moved ahead of her with his nose working the snow surface. And whenever he slowed at a particular spot, not stopping to investigate like a dog that smells prey, but slowing with the specific quality of an animal, noting where other animals had concentrated their weight, she marked the location. 3 of those spots became the most productive trap sites she had, as though he were reading a map written in the snow that she could see but not fully interpret. The first rabbit was small, barely 2 pounds, dressed with a thin layer of fat that told her the animal had been working hard through early winter and hadn't been storing well. She cleaned it with the bone-handled knife using the method Fletcher had demonstrated twice, and made her practice once, not elegant but efficient, each cut purposeful, nothing wasted. The meat went onto a greenwood rack over a low fire and stayed there for 4 hours, the smoke thin enough to dissipate before it became a signal. The fat she rendered into the small tin cup she'd found near the creek on the second day, packed with debris but intact. The hide she stretched on a frame of bent willow and propped near the fire to dry, which took 2 days. A stretched rabbit hide is not much, but it is something the same way a single entry on a record board is not much. The value was in the repeatability. Hazel had set 8 snares. If 4 of them produced once a week, she had a system. If the system could be maintained, the winner could be calculated. She ran the numbers on the record board for the first time on the 11th day. Flour, 18 days at strict ration. Beans, 12 meals if supplemented with other protein. Rabbit ongoing requirement at a minimum of 2 per week. Firewood, the true constraint, the variable that set the ceiling for everything else. Because without heat, there was no cooking, and without cooking, the flour and beans were unusable. She stared at the board for a long time after finishing, not because the numbers were alarming, they weren't, not yet, but because seeing them made the situation concrete in a way that feeling it in her body couldn't quite accomplish. On the 14th day, she started to work on the chimney. Solomon Craft's notebook was specific about the chimney in the way that painful experience makes people specific. Not theoretically, not as general advice, but with the precision of someone describing a mistake they came very close to not surviving. The entry ran across 3 pages, the handwriting tighter than usual, as though the memory of the incident had compressed his script. He'd built his first heating fire confident that the hollow's natural vertical shaft would draw smoke upward without assistance. Instead, a pressure differential he hadn't anticipated had reversed the draft. The smoke collected at ceiling height and descended. He'd lost consciousness briefly before the cold air he'd let in by crawling to the entrance had revived him enough to get outside. She read it twice before beginning. The construction required clay, which meant a trip to the creek bank where the soil changed character below the frost line and turned the specific reddish-gray color that meant workable material. She carried it back in the tin cup trip by trip, building a small stock inside the entrance where it wouldn't freeze. Flat stones from the hillside provided the structure a low box hearth against the north wall open at the front, with a clay-lined channel rising toward a notch. She cut into the wood above, using the knife and a chisel improvised from a sharpened rock. The geometry was what Solomon had labored over in his notes. The smoke outlet needed to be positioned above a specific height relative to the fire to create the pressure differential that pulled rather than pushed. Too low and the draft reversed. Too high and the heat escaped faster than it was produced. He'd included measurements in his cramped handwriting, cross-referenced to the interior dimensions of the cottonwood, which he'd described in enough detail that she could correlate them to what she was actually working with. She mixed the clay with dry grass fiber for binding, pressed it into the channel joints, let it dry for a day near the fire before testing. The first test lasted 6 minutes before the smoke turned wrong. Not as catastrophically as Solomon had described, the design was closer to correct than his first attempt had been, but close enough. Gray haze moved along the ceiling in the wrong direction, thickening near the rear wall rather than rising toward the outlet. Cinder was on his feet and moving toward the entrance before Hazel fully registered the problem. She killed the fire fast, opened the door, stood in the entrance, breathing cold air for 10 minutes with her eyes running. The mistake when she found it was in the outlet angle. She'd cut it straight horizontal, which created a pocket where pressure could stall. Solomon's drawing, looked at again more carefully, showed a slight upward tilt to the channel's terminus, a detail she'd initially read as imprecision in his sketch rather than instruction. She widened the outlet by 1/2 inch, tilted the clay channel 2 degrees upward, packed fresh clay around the adjustment, let it cure overnight. The second test ran clean. She sat back on her heels and watched smoke rise in the correct direction for the first time, threading upward through the shaft, dissipating before it reached the crack at the top. Enough draw to clear the chamber, not enough to signal her position from the ridgeline. The fire in the hearth put out a warmth that spread across the interior differently than the open fires she'd been using, more evenly, held longer by the clay box. The cottonwood's thick walls catching it and giving it back in the slow currency of good insulation. She added 3 lines to the record board that evening: chimney functional. Wood consumption less than estimated. Interior temperature significantly improved. The significantly was not a word she used lightly. On day 19, working on the last section of the interior floor, she hadn't yet disturbed her bark shovel, struck something that wasn't earth. The sound was wrong. Not the dull scrape of root fiber, not the percussive crack of embedded stone. A hollow report, brief, resonant, the kind of sound a space makes when it's been enclosed long enough to develop an acoustic memory. She stopped, set the shovel aside, knelt down. She cleared the loose material with her hands, working in careful arcs outward from the point of contact. The shape that emerged was rectangular, too regular to be accidental, the corners meeting at right angles that soil and root fiber do not produce without human intention. A flat stone, perhaps 18 inches on each side, its surface worn smooth in the center, where it had been lifted many times before someone set it down for the last time. She worked her fingers under the edge, felt the weight of it, repositioned. Her grip lifted with her legs rather than her back, the way her father had taught her when she was 12 and first learning to manage cargo. Beneath it was a cavity perhaps 8 inches deep, cut into the earth, the walls tamped firm. The interior smelled of old oilcloth and dry thyme. Her hand went in before she thought about whether it should, and her fingers found the bundle, stiff, smooth, tied with a cord that felt like leather but had dried to something closer to wood. She carried it toward the entrance without unwrapping it. Daylight was stronger there, and her hands were shaking slightly in the way they shook when she was cold, though she didn't think that was the reason. The oilcloth unfolded in layers, each one releasing a smell that was specific to age, not rot because the cloth had kept moisture out, but the concentrated smell of sealed time of air that had been making do with itself for a very long while. 4 items inside coined silver, she counted them without picking them up. 11, a knife folding with a handle of dark polished wood, the blade visible through the open latch as high-quality steel. A notebook, small, its cover of thick cloth worn pale at the corners. A letter folded to a quarter of its original size. The outer surface carrying handwriting that had faded to the color of the paper it was written on, so that reading it required tilting the page until the light came from an angle. She read the outside first to whoever finds this. Then she unfolded it. The handwriting inside had fared better, protected from light by the fold. The man who had written it called himself Solomon Kraft. He was a trapper, he explained without preamble, as though formality had seemed pointless in the circumstances of composition. He had lived inside this cottonwood through 2 full winters in the mid-1850s, trapping the northern valleys before his health made the work impossible. He had left these items deliberately, he wrote, because leaving them seemed more useful than taking them somewhere they would sit unused. But he wrote that with the tone of a man who had carefully considered whether the gesture was practical rather than sentimental. What followed was not the tone of a man passing on valuables. It was the tone of a man passing on a reckoning. He described his first chimney attempt in the same terms she'd seen failure in herself, and the reading of it was strange to hold an account of someone else's near death in the same space where you have just prevented your own. He described a food storage mistake that cost him 3 weeks of preserved meat. In the first winter, the lesson bought with hunger that lasted until he could reestablish his trapping lines. He described a door construction that failed in a January wind, and the repairs made at 3 in the morning with hands he couldn't fully feel, and what it cost him physically for the week following. Each entry in the letter was a loss. Each loss had been paid for and converted into something more reliable than the ignorance that had caused it. Near the bottom of the final page, his handwriting changed character slightly, not less careful, but slower, the letters forming with the deliberateness of a man choosing words that he wanted to be accurate. If you are reading this, winter is probably trying to kill you, the same way it once tried to kill me. The silver may help for a little while. The notes will help much longer. I hope you are the kind of person who knows the difference. She set the letter down on her knee. Through the entrance, the afternoon light was doing what October light does in Idaho, when it's honest, falling at an angle that made everything look temporarily more significant than it was, catching the ice crystals in the snow along the creek bank, turning the bare aspen trunks to something close to white fire. Then she opened the notebook. Solomon Kraft had been a systematic man. The notebook was organized not chronologically but functionally, sections divided by topic, in a system he'd established at the beginning and maintained through both winters without deviation. Temperature observations dated by day and written in a format that allowed comparison across the same dates in different years. Firewood consumption tables that tracked the relationship between outside temperature and interior usage at different fire management strategies. Trapping records, not just catches, but pattern analysis, where animals concentrated, when how those concentrations shifted in response to weather. Which sites remained productive through the deep cold of February when others went cold. Sketches of the chimney at its final working configuration dimension. A section on water access when the creek froze and how to maintain a supply without the labor of full-depth ice cutting. At the bottom of the chimney sketches, he had written a note she had to read twice to fully absorb. The smoke outlet took me 3 attempts. The first nearly killed me. The second wasted a week. The third worked. I have included the final measurements. Use them exactly. The geometry is not forgiving of approximation. She had used them. She had arrived at the third attempt from a different direction, but arrived at the same place. This, she understood, was what the notebook was for, to collapse the distance between someone else's third attempt and your first competent one. Near the end of the notebook, in a section on weather reading, Solomon had written an entry that was longer than those around it. The entry was dated the 5th day of a blizzard in the winter of 1856. He described the signs he'd seen in the days preceding it, the silence that fell over the valley, the behavioral changes in the animals, the particular quality of the sky that he tried to describe in the limited vocabulary available to a man who trapped for a living and had not been trained in any kind of scientific observation. Then in the middle of the entry, his subject changed without announcement. On the 5th day, I heard something at the door that was not wind. I have heard wind for 5 days, and I know what wind sounds like. What I heard was a pattern. I opened the door. Outside was a child, perhaps 8 years old, wearing a coat that belonged to someone considerably larger. The child did not speak, did not say a name, did not say where they came from, did not indicate anything about how they had come to be standing outside this particular tree in the 5th day of a blizzard. I brought the child inside. I built the fire higher than my wood budget recommended. We sat until the storm broke. On the morning of the 6th day, when I woke before dawn, the child was gone. I do not know in which direction. I do not know if they reached wherever they were going. I have thought about this child at the beginning of every hard winter since, and it has not become easier to not know. Hazel read the passage twice. Outside, the creek moved under its partial ice covering with the muted persistence of water that refuses to stop entirely, regardless of what the temperature demands. Cinder was asleep in the rear of the hollow, his breathing the slow measure of an animal, fully warm, fully settled with no outstanding concerns. The child Solomon had described would be in their mid-30s now, if they'd survived. She closed the notebook and held it in both hands for a moment, thinking about the particular mathematics of what someone chooses to leave behind. Solomon Kraft had left silver because it had practical value, had left the trapping knife because it was a good knife, had left the notebook because he had spent 2 winters filling it with lessons that cost him significantly to learn. What he had not expected to leave probably was the record of the child that was just an entry from a particular day, included because he was a systematic man who wrote down what happened. He had not known it would matter. He had written it the way he wrote everything, because it was true, because it was part of the account. She added a line to the record board that evening, day 19. Found items beneath floor. 11 silver coins, 1 knife, 1 notebook, 1 letter. Name Solomon Kraft. Period 1850s. Assessment. The notebook is worth more than the silver. Then she went back to the letter and read it one more time from the beginning. The trading post was 2 days south-southeast, according to Solomon's notes. He described it in the section on supply logistics, its position relative to the freight route that ran through the northern Idaho valleys. The character of its proprietor at the time of his writing, taciturn fare, not the sort to ask questions that didn't relate to the transaction at hand. She could not know whether that description still applied or whether the post was even still operating, but the alternative was attempting to extend her current supplies indefinitely without restocking, and the arithmetic on that possibility had a visible bottom. She left 9 silver coins in the cavity beneath the flagstone, replaced the stone, covered it with the cleared earth. 2 coins went into the inside pocket of her coat beside the bracelet. Cinder watched this process from his position in the sleeping area with the attentive expression of a dog who has learned that changes in preparation often precede interesting events. The journey south consumed 3.5 days. The weather held cold clear after the first morning, the kind of winter travel that is hard work but not dangerous work, the difference between a problem being significant and being serious. She moved through country that was different from the hollow surroundings. Lower elevation, more open, the timber interspersed with meadow sections that made her feel exposed in the way that open ground makes you feel exposed when you've been living in the shelter of the close-grown forest. The trading post was where Solomon's notes had placed it, a low structure of squared logs with a lean-to addition on the east side and a hitching post out front that had been repaired recently enough that the new wood was still paler than the old. The proprietor was a man of perhaps 50 with the unhurried quality of someone who has been in one place long enough to stop anticipating things. He looked at Hazel, looked at Cinder, made whatever assessment he made about the combination of a teenage girl traveling alone with a large black dog in November, and arrived at the conclusion that this was the ordinary commerce of the territory. She was clearly attached to some trapping operation working the northern ridges. It was not his business which one. 2 silver coins bought more than she'd expected. A 5-pound cloth sack of flour, a pound of salt, 2 pounds of dried navy beans, a small paper packet of coffee grounds, a box of friction matches, a steel sewing needle in a paper envelope, a spool of waxed linen thread. The proprietor wrapped the dry goods against moisture without being asked, using the brown paper he kept behind the counter, for the purpose tying each package with twine. She watched him work and noted the efficiency of it, the way his hands moved through a familiar task, without requiring his attention all the focus available for other things. She was back at the hollow on the afternoon of the 4th day. That evening she updated the record board with the new inventory, working through the calculations with the methodical patience that Solomon's notebook had modeled, and that her father's freight records had first taught her. Flour 18 days at current ration, perhaps 22, if the rabbit lines continued producing at their recent rate. Beans 12 full meals more if used as supplement rather than primary. Coffee small quantity reserve. Matches now sufficient. The needle and thread went into the right corner storage area designated for repair materials because in a shelter that relied on a single woven door and a chimney sealed with clay, the ability to fix things was as critical as the original construction. She reinforced the door frame after the supply run, discovering that the left stake had worked slightly loose during a cold snap while she was gone. She caught it before it became consequential, which was the only way to catch things before. She deepened the drainage channel alongside the entrance, which had been collecting meltwater from the south-facing exposure and directing it toward the floor rather than away. She raised the food storage platform by 4 inches after finding that the overnight temperature differential between the floor surface and the air, 18 inches above it, was significant enough to matter for preservation. Each improvement was small. Each improvement was also the difference between a system that held under pressure and a system that failed at the worst available moment. Late one afternoon, Hazel read Solomon's final notebook entry again. It was brief, only 6 lines written at what she estimated was the end of his second winter, in handwriting slightly less controlled than the earlier entries suggesting cold hands or fatigue, or simply the accumulated wear of 2 Idaho winters on a man past his middle years. He had written, "The animals do not prepare for one storm. They prepare for the nature of winter. That is the distinction I have spent 2 seasons learning to make. Prepare for the event, and you may survive it. Prepare for the nature of the thing, and you have a chance at the whole season." She wrote that on the record board beneath her own entries in smaller letters to fit the remaining space. By mid-January, the valley changed. She noticed the absence of new snow first 3 days, then 5, without the usual overnight dustings that had been regular since November. The wind dropped to almost nothing. The sky settled into a flat, pewter color that had no depth to it, no movement, no variation between morning and midday and dusk. It looked like the sky had run out of ideas. The animals read it differently than she did. Rabbit traffic on the trail lines dropped sharply, the prints becoming scarce where they'd been consistent. The deer that had been moving through the lower end of the hollow each morning stopped appearing. Most notably the ravens that had been a constant feature of the ridge above her. Their ragged transits, a kind of irregular clock she'd been using to mark the progress of mornings, simply weren't there. Not fewer, not present elsewhere. Absent. Cinder started doing something he hadn't done before. In the mornings when Hazel opened the door for his first run of the day, he would stop just outside the entrance and lift his muzzle toward the north, holding the position with a focused stillness that was different from his ordinary alertness. Not listening, not scenting something specific, something more like paying attention to a frequency below the threshold of ordinary noise. He would hold it for 2 minutes, sometimes 3 minutes, while she stood in the entrance watching him, before he shook his head once and went about his morning. She returned to Solomon's notebook each evening that week, rereading the section on the 1856 storm. His account of the preceding days was written in a tone of someone noting events without yet knowing their significance. The quiet, the animal absence, the particular quality of the air that he struggled to describe more precisely than the word heavy. He had understood what was coming only in retrospect, which was why he'd written it down, so that whoever came next would have the advantage of recognition rather than discovery. She set the notebook down one evening and looked at the entrance of the cottonwood. Outside, the forest was performing the most complete silence she'd heard since arriving at the hollow. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of a specific kind of quiet that has weight and intention. Something large was assembling itself beyond the northern mountains, the way weather assembles when it has the patience to do it properly. Hazel looked at the record board, at the inventory numbers, at the chimney check marks, at the door modification notes. She looked at the firewood stacked in tight rows along the left wall. She looked at Cinder, who had returned from his evening position and was lying in the sleeping area with his head between his paws, his eyes open, watching her watch the entrance. She added 2 words to the bottom of that day's record entry: waiting, ready. Then she added 1 more log to the fire, banked the coals, carefully lay down in the sleeping area, pulled the green wool sweater over her chest as supplemental cover, listened to the perfect silence of the valley for a long time before sleep arrived. It was still silent when she closed her eyes. The storm arrived without the courtesy of announcement. 1 hour the hollow sat in its unnatural quiet, the same silence that had been building for 6 days, the kind that presses against the ears like held breath. The next hour the mountains to the north ceased to exist, not obscured, erased. The wind hit the cottonwood with a physical force that Hazel felt through the soles of her boots, a vibration that traveled up through the floor, through her legs into her chest, as though the tree was absorbing a blow. It had absorbed 1,000 times before, but was not pretending, was trivial. Snow followed immediately behind the wind, not falling so much as moving laterally. Fine crystals sharp enough to sting exposed skin, driving through every gap in the entrance frame, before the storm thickened into something denser, a wall of white that reduced the visible world to the distance between Hazel's face and her outstretched hand. She got the door secured in the first 30 seconds. The locking bar dropped into its notches cleanly the way it had been designed to, the way she'd tested it 6 times before trusting it. Then she built the fire up from its bank state, not to full capacity, but to the steady medium burn that Solomon's notes recommended for sustained cold enough heat to maintain a livable interior temperature without burning through the wood supply at a rate the storm's duration might outpace. Cinder positioned himself in the sleeping area facing the entrance, his chin on his paws monitoring. The first day was about discipline. She moved through the routines she'd established over the preceding weeks with the deliberate economy of someone who understands that routine is not comfort in a situation like this. It is a structural element, load-bearing, in the same way the cottonwood's walls were load-bearing. Firewood from the stacked rows to the hearth in measured amounts. Flour and bean rations prepared with the precision she'd been maintaining since the supply run, no more, no less. Water melted from clean snow collected near the entrance where the ground was unpacked. Temperature estimate recorded on the board. Chimney check draft confirmed correct, nothing requiring adjustment. Every few hours she cleared the snow accumulating at the base of the door, with a flat piece of bark pushing it back outside through the gap at the door's lower edge, before it could compact into the kind of mass that would make the door difficult to open. This was not in Solomon's notes, it was something she'd reasoned out from first principles during the preceding days of silence. The understanding that a door that cannot open is not a door, but a wall. And a wall with no exit is a different kind of problem than the cold. The second day brought stronger wind. The cottonwood moved in ways she hadn't felt before. Not flexing its mass was too great for that, but transmitting the storm's energy in deep structural groans, a sound below ordinary hearing that she perceived more as pressure behind the sternum than as sound itself. Snow was coming under the door's lower edge now, despite her clearing efforts, fine powder infiltrating through the small gap between the bark panel and the frozen ground. She packed it with strips of the rabbit hide she'd been accumulating, pressing them tight into the gap with her fingers working by feel as much as sight, because the light through the upper crack had been effectively blocked by snow accumulation above. The interior ran on firelight. The fire made the right sounds, the steady low combustion of well-seasoned wood in a properly drafting hearth, occasional small pops when a knot released its last moisture. The shadows it threw on the dry wood walls were the only movement in the chamber. On the record board that evening, she wrote the temperature estimate the wood consumed the food remaining, then paused with the charcoal in her hand before adding one more line. Storm day 2. All systems holding. Maintain. It was the kind of entry that would seem obvious to anyone reading it later. It was written for herself, for the version of herself that might exist at the end of the next 12 hours, who would need to be reminded that holding had once been possible. The third day, the world beyond the entrance ceased to exist in any practical sense. She opened the door twice to check conditions, holding it against the wind's pressure with her shoulder. And each time the sight was the same white, moving without depth or feature. The timber that she knew was 30 feet away, simply absent. She could hear it occasionally, a muffled percussion, when a gust stripped a branch, but she could not see it. Life had narrowed to the interior of the cottonwood, to a fire, a wood supply, a food calculation, a dog. She had not spoken aloud in 3 days. She had not needed to. By the fourth day, the snow had climbed above the midpoint of the doorframe. She discovered this on her morning clearance check, opening the door against unusual resistance, finding that the drift against the outside face had built while she'd slept to a height that left only the upper third of the entrance accessible. She used the bark shovel to break the drift back far enough to restore the full opening, dragging the loosened snow inside, temporarily sweeping it back out with her boot, working in the wind with her face turned down and away. It took 40 minutes. When she was done, she stood inside with her back against the door, breathing hard, calculating. If the storm lasted 3 more days at this accumulation rate, clearance would become the primary labor of each morning, consuming wood warmth at a rate the fire budget might not sustain. That was when she first felt the full weight of what she was actually inside. Not the cottonwood, not a winter shelter. The specific mathematical intersection of wood supply and storm duration and human physical capacity, a problem with a solution that depended entirely on variables she could not control. She had done everything Solomon's notes recommended. She had done everything her own experience had taught her over the preceding months. Whether that was enough was a question that would be answered by the storm, not by her, and the storm had not yet indicated how long it intended to take with the answer. Cinder came to her in the middle of that fourth afternoon, which he did not ordinarily do during daylight hours. He pushed his head against her knee with the firm, deliberate pressure of an animal making a specific point, and when she put her hand on him, she could feel the solidity of his presence, the way you feel a wall when you put your hand against it in the dark. Something substantial, something real, something that the dark hadn't touched. She kept her hand on him for a while. Neither of them moved. The fourth night broke the arithmetic. She woke to a sound that was wrong in the specific way that wrong sounds at night are wrong, not loud, not dramatic, but misaligned with everything that had been consistent, like a note played slightly flat in a piece of music you've memorized. She lay still for 3 seconds, cataloging it. A creak that wasn't the cottonwood structural groan, higher pitched, localized to the left side of the entrance, followed by a vibration she felt through the sleeping area floor rather than heard. Then the brace on the left side of the doorframe gave. Not gradually, not as a warning. The wood had been under continuous lateral stress for 96 hours, and it reached its threshold and passed it in a single moment, the stake pulling from the frozen ground with a sound like a rifle shot in an enclosed space. The door swung inward on its remaining right side lashing, and the storm entered the cottonwood with the full force it had been holding in reserve against the barrier for 4 days. The fire bent to the horizontal. Loose snow scattered across the floor in a wave that reached the rear wall. The temperature dropped a measurable degree in what felt like seconds, the cold so absolute it had a taste to it. Hazel was already moving. She didn't think. Thanking would have required time she didn't have. Her body moved from the accumulated logic of everything she'd built and reinforced and tested and rebuilt toward the door, toward the problem, toward the specific failure that needed to be addressed in the next 10 minutes, or would be addressed never. She grabbed the lantern from its hook, lit it from the coal bed with hands that shook from cold, rather than fear shook the distinction away, because it didn't matter, took the knife from her belt. Cinder was at the entrance before she was. He pressed his body into the gap where the broken brace had left a space between the door's left edge and the frame, his mass partially blocking the inflow of wind, his weight against the panel buying her 6 inches of stability where she had none. She didn't direct him. He'd made the calculation himself. She drove the replacement stake, a piece she'd cut 2 weeks earlier, for exactly this contingency, stored in the firewood stack where it would stay dry into the ground at the entrance's base, using the river stone she kept for the purpose, hitting it with both hands. Every blow landing at the correct angle, because she'd practiced the motion on a calm afternoon when there was nothing at stake. The frozen ground resisted. She hit it again. The stake went in 1/2 inch. She hit it 5 more times. 1.5 inches. She needed 3. The wind was working against her with impersonal efficiency, finding every gap between her coat and her collar, every place where her cuffs had pulled back from her gloves, applying cold to exposed skin with the patience of something that doesn't tire. Her left hand was numb past the wrist when she added the second brace, lashing it to the frame with the deer hide strips from her coat pocket. She'd started carrying them there 2 weeks ago because Solomon's notes had mentioned keeping repair materials accessible. Though his phrasing had been the repair you cannot make is always the one where the materials are in the wrong place. The knife slipped on the 4th lashing. She felt the blade across the base of her right index finger more as pressure than pain. Cold skin registers impact before it registers cut. Then felt the warm wet of blood against the inside of her glove, which she could not stop to address. She finished the lashing with the blood making the leather tacky under her fingers, which actually improved her grip, a fact she noted with the detached clarity that extreme focus sometimes produces. The brace held. She added a 3rd lashing above the first 2, pulled it tight with both hands, tested the give in the panel by pushing against it from inside. It held. She added the cross brace she'd been considering adding for 3 weeks and kept deferring because the door had been holding, driving it into the frame at the diagonal that took the lateral stress off the vertical stakes. A geometry she'd worked out, looking at the barn structure in Duskwater during her childhood, without knowing she was storing it for a specific future use. The cross brace changed the force distribution across the whole assembly, shifting it from a door that was resisting the storm to a door that was redirecting it. By the time she stepped back from the entrance, the wind was still present, but no longer inside the room. Cinder moved away from the gap and stood beside her, looking at the door the way he sometimes looked at things he'd decided were resolved. The fire had dropped to near nothing while she worked. She rebuilt it from the coal bed with the wood she kept in reach of the hearth for exactly that purpose, working in order of size, letting each piece establish before adding the next, ignoring the cold in her right hand until the flames were stable. Then she sat down, unwrapped the glove, looked at the cut. It was not deep. It would not require more than she had available. She packed it with a strip of clean cloth from the repair kit, wrapped it tight, put the glove back on. Added the incident to the record board in the morning with the same spare language she used for everything else. Door brace, failure night 4. Repaired under storm conditions, cut to right-hand minor, repair holding. The 5th day, the storm began to lose confidence. It was subtle, the kind of change that only becomes visible if you've been living inside the alternative for long enough. The gusts became less continuous, interrupted by pauses that lasted 5 seconds, then 10, then nearly a minute. The sound signature of the wind shifted from its sustained roar towards something more irregular, as though it was spending energy in bursts rather than maintaining a constant pressure. She registered these changes on the board as they occurred, not because the record required it, but because tracking them gave her something to push against the impulse toward passive waiting that extreme enclosure produces. Cinder began sleeping through the night again, rather than lifting his head at each structural groan. The 6th morning arrived with what it had withheld for nearly a week's silence. Not the weighted anticipatory silence of the days before the storm. A different quality spent settled the silence of something that is finished rather than something that is gathering. She lay in the sleeping area for 10 minutes, simply listening to it, the way you listen to a sound you've been straining to hear, once it finally arrives with the full attention of someone who doesn't yet trust it to stay. She pushed against the door. Snow resistance higher than usual, the drift had rebuilt overnight against the repaired panel. A second push with her shoulder rather than her hands broke through it. Cold air entered the cottonwood with the specific quality of cold air after a storm different from storm cold, carrying the smell of disturbed earth and broken wood, and the mineral clarity that follows several feet of snowfall across a forested valley. The outside world had been redistributed. Snow stood shoulder-high along the base of the ridge, consuming the lower third of the timberline. 3 large pines on the eastern slope had not survived. She could see them from the entrance, their root masses exposed to the sky, their trunks laid across the hillside at the angles they'd fallen. Branches littered every open surface. The creek had disappeared entirely beneath a continuous white slope that showed no variation to indicate where the water ran below. The cottonwood stood exactly where it had stood before any of this happened. She walked its perimeter slowly without hurry, the snow packing under her boots in the compressed way it packs after several days of accumulation and one night of settling. She inspected the entrance repair. First, the braces were solid. The lashings had held in the cold, without contracting to the point of failure, which she'd considered as a risk when working in the dark. The chimney outlet at the top of the trunk was clear, the heat from the maintained fire having prevented accumulation in the channel. The drainage trench beside the entrance was full of snow, but intact beneath it, a distinction that mattered for the melt that would come. When she came back inside, she stood in front of the record board for a long time. It was nearly full. The surface she'd started writing on 60-something days ago had accumulated entries until the margins were gone. The date columns compressed the later entries written in smaller characters to fit what remained of the space. It was a document of a winter or most of one. It was also a document of something that couldn't be fully named from inside it. A set of decisions made in sequence, each one responding to the consequence of the one before it. All of them adding up to something that was still against reasonable probability alive. She took the charcoal from its hook beside the board. At the bottom corner, in the last space available, she wrote the final line in the same small, deliberate letters she'd been using since October storm ended. Day 6, all systems intact, wood remaining sufficient, food sufficient, right hand healing. The weeks that followed had a different rhythm than anything that had come before. Not the driven intensity of preparation, not the contained vigilance of the storm, but the slower, more uncertain work of learning to exist in a place rather than simply survive in it. She extended the trap lines as the snow settled and the animals returned. The rabbits came back to their established trails within 10 days of the storm's end. She found deer sign on the 12th day, which told her the herd had moved back to the lower ground from wherever they'd sheltered through the worst of it. She added a new section to the record board, a split piece of bark she nailed to the wall beside the original, and began tracking the recovery of the valley's activity alongside her own supply numbers. Cinder's morning ritual changed. He no longer stood at the entrance facing north with that particular weighted attention. He moved through the day with a lighter quality, more interested in the immediate environment. She understood what that meant, not because she could read a dog's nervous system, but because she recognized the shift from defensive to operational. One morning in late March, the smoke from the cottonwood's chimney caught the still air above the hollow and rose in a column visible from the ridge above. Then from the ridge beyond that, then from the eastern approach to the valley where a man named Rupert Aldane was working a trapline. He'd run through the northern Idaho territory for most of his life. Rupe had seen smoke in 1,000 places over the years. He'd seen it from legitimate camps, from accidents, from the careless fires of inexperienced travelers. Smoke rising from the middle of an isolated hollow in late winter, straight columned in still air, indicating a fire that was neither new nor distressed, but simply consistent. That was a different category. That was a fire being managed by someone who knew what they were doing with it. He came to investigate. Hazel saw him before he saw the entrance. A man in his middle 30s, lean in the way that years of outdoor work make a person lean, moving through the snow with the efficient, unhurried pace of someone who has been reading terrain since before he could name what he was doing. He led a pack mule that carried gear with the same organized weight distribution her father had used on his freight horses. She watched him from inside the entrance without announcing herself the way Fletcher had taught her. Learn what you can before committing to the interaction. He stopped outside the cottonwood and looked at it the way she'd looked at it the first day, with the attention of someone revising their expectations upward. He looked at the entrance assembly first, not quickly with the brief scan of ordinary curiosity, but with the extended examination of someone who builds things and wants to understand what they're looking at. The braces, the lashings, the cross member added on the fourth night. He moved his gaze to the drainage trench, now visible as a slight depression in the snow along the south wall, to the remnant of the wood cache structure she'd built against the north side of the trunk, to the chimney outlet at the top of the tree, currently producing the thin, steady smoke that had brought him here. Then he stepped inside and read the record board. She let him. She stood near the rear wall while he moved closer to the board, close enough to read the smaller entries, and she watched his face move through whatever it moved through when a man reads several months of someone else's winter in 45 seconds. He was not performing a reaction. His face made the adjustments of genuine processing, the slight shift at one entry, the stillness at another, the small compression around the eyes that meant something had registered as significant. His gaze moved from the board to the chimney assembly, to the entrance repair visible from inside, to the knife hanging on its hook near the door, the dark-handled folding knife from Solomon's oilcloth bundle. He stopped at the knife. His hand came up and touched the handle, not lifting it from its hook, just touching it the way you touch something you recognize from a context you hadn't expected. His face changed character entirely, the professional assessment dropping away and something older replacing it, something that looked like a man being returned to a specific point in time against his will. His voice, when it came, was quieter than his frame suggested. "I know this knife." Hazel said nothing. He turned to look at her with the expression of a man revising his understanding of a situation that had been presenting as straightforward. "The man who carried it, is he still alive?" She shook her head. He was quiet for a moment. "What was his name?" "Solomon Kraft." Rupe Aldane looked back at the knife on its hook. Outside, the snow was doing what March snow does in northern Idaho, holding in the shade, surrendering in the sun, making the landscape a study in the argument between the season that was ending and the one that wanted to begin. He was quiet for long enough that she began to think he'd finished speaking. He hadn't. What came next arrived slowly, like something he'd been deciding whether to say. There was a blizzard in the winter of 1856. I was 8 years old. I'd gotten separated from my family's camp. We were moving through this valley trying to reach my uncle's place before the weather closed down. I miscalculated distance, or the storm moved faster than anyone expected, and I was out in it alone on the 5th day. He paused. I found a hollow tree with a light under the door. I knocked. An old man opened it and let me in without asking a single question. He built the fire up. He fed me something hot. In the morning when the storm broke, I found my way back to camp. He looked at the record board, then back at the knife. I never knew his name. I have thought about him at the beginning of every bad winter since I was 8 years old, and I never knew his name. The hollow was very quiet. The fire made its steady sounds. Cinder, who had positioned himself midway between Hazel and the stranger, with the instinct of a dog maintaining options, lowered his head back to his paws. Hazel looked at the man who had been the child in Solomon Kraft's notebook, the child who had knocked on the door of this exact tree on the 5th day of a blizzard nearly 30 years ago, who had sat by this exact hearth in a coat too large for him, who had left before dawn without saying his name. The man who had spent 30 years not knowing if the old trapper had survived, not knowing what he'd been called. He was standing in Solomon's shelter again, reading Solomon's record board, and he had no idea until this moment that any of it had been written down. She took the notebook from its storage place and opened it to the entry. She held it out to him. He read it standing up. She watched him read it. His face when he finished was the face of someone who has just received information that reorganizes a significant portion of their past, not the facts of it, but the meaning of it. Who Solomon had been. What the old trapper had carried with him in the years after. The specific weight of not knowing whether a child had survived translated into the specific relief of knowing that the not knowing had run in both directions. Rupert Aldane was not a man who demonstrated emotion the way people demonstrate it when they want to be seen demonstrating it. What she observed was quieter than that, a breath released through the nose, a settling of the shoulders by perhaps half an inch. The hand setting the notebook down on the storage shelf with a carefulness that was more than the notebook required. He came back several times over the weeks that followed, sometimes alone, sometimes with people from the settlements to the south and east, who had heard the story, the way stories travel in that territory, not through newspapers, but through the economy of campfires, and trading counter conversations passed from mouth to mouth with the particular fidelity that practical people give to information that seems useful. A 17-year-old girl had survived the worst blizzard the northern Idaho valleys had seen in 15 years alone. Except for a dog and a hollow tree, she'd converted into a functioning winter shelter with records to prove the whole account. People came expecting a story about luck. They left telling a story about something that had no single word. Rupe brought his sister Opal on his third visit. She was a few years older than him with the deliberate quality of a woman who had survived her own version of difficult and had organized herself around the things that actually mattered. She handed Hazel a quilt when she arrived, pieced from worn work shirts, bleached flour sacking, a section of old wool blanket, the stitching tight and regular as her brother's trap lines. It was not a decorative object. Every material in it had already served a first purpose and been reconstituted into a second one. Hazel held it for a moment with both hands before folding it and placing it in the sleeping area. A week later, she found a piece of cottonwood branch with a straight grain section long enough for what she needed. She worked it in the evenings over 3 days, with the knife taking her time, with the proportions getting the angle of the tilted head right, the way the wings folded against the body, with that particular compressed patience. When she was done, it looked the way the owl Fletcher had given her, looked not identical, but recognizable as the same idea in a different hand. She gave it to Opal on her next visit without explanation, because explanation would have made it into something it wasn't supposed to be. Opal turned it over, examined the grain, looked at Hazel for a moment with a comprehension that didn't require words, then put it in her coat pocket. One afternoon in early April, Roop arrived with a particular quality of stillness about him, the kind a person carries when they're delivering information they don't know how to introduce. Someone from Duskwater had been asking for directions to the hollow, a woman traveling alone. Hazel went inside after he told her. She stood for a while looking at the record board, not at any specific entry, but at the whole surface, at what it had become over the months. Not a document of survival, though it was that. A document of attention, of what happens when a person refuses to stop paying attention regardless of what the conditions are. Cecily Merritt appeared at the edge of the hollow the following morning. She came alone, which said something. She'd walked from wherever she'd left her horse arriving, without the posture of someone who expects the situation to accommodate them. She stopped outside the entrance range and looked at the shelter with an expression Hazel couldn't categorize from a distance, something between assessment and something older moving beneath the practical surface of the woman's face, like water under ice. Hazel walked out to meet her. She stopped 6 feet away, close enough for conversation, far enough to be a choice rather than a habit. She looked at Cecily the way Cecily had once looked at her, with attention, without hostility, taking inventory. Cecily spoke first, which was consistent with everything Hazel knew of her. "I've come for what's mine." The specificity was also consistent, Not anger, not apology, a transaction framed the way Cecily framed everything that made her uncomfortable as something with clear terms. The knife, she said. It had been Gareth's before it was anyone else's, and she had come to collect it. Hazel looked at her for a long moment. She thought about the bag on the doorstep, about the bracelet at the bottom of it, about the particular arithmetic of a woman who had spent 18 months building a case for an action she couldn't bring herself to name honestly. She thought about the winter just finished, about what it had required and what it had produced, about the distance between who she'd been standing on that doorstep in October and who was standing here now in the April light. Her voice when she used it was not loud. It didn't need to be. You put the bracelet in the bag yourself? She wasn't asking. It was never missing. Something crossed Cecily's face that was neither admission nor denial. It crossed and passed the way weather moves across a landscape that doesn't change to accommodate it. Hazel reached into her coat and took out the bracelet. She had carried it through the entire winter in the interior pocket, where it had stayed warm through the storm, through the repair of the door in the dark, through every cold morning and every inventory calculation. She held it out. This belongs to you. It always did. The knife belonged to my father. This place is mine. The words were simple. They didn't reach for effect. They carried the weight of everything that had preceded them, the way a structure carries the weight of everything that went into its building invisibly in the specific resistance it offers when something tries to move it. Cecily looked at the bracelet in Hazel's palm. She looked at the cottonwood. She looked at Hazel with an expression that had finally run out of the things it had been using to protect itself. And what remained underneath was just a woman who had loved a man and lost him, and had not handled the loss with any particular grace, standing in the evidence of what her failure had set in motion. She took the bracelet. She didn't speak. She turned and walked back toward the tree line with the posture of a woman who has received exactly what she came for, and nothing additional, which was the only way she knew how to leave a situation she didn't control. Rupe was near the aspens far enough not to have heard the exchange, close enough to have been present if the situation had required him. He watched Cecily's figure disappear into the timber. Then he looked at Hazel. He didn't speak. He nodded once, and that was sufficient. That evening, Hazel sat alone beside the fire. The record board rested against her knees. She wasn't reading it. She knew what it said. She was holding it the way you hold something that has become significant in ways exceeding its material composition. She took the charcoal. In the last available space on the bark panel, she wrote Spring 1884. Still here. Cinder was asleep against her leg, his breathing in the slow measure of an animal at complete ease. Outside, the valley was doing what valleys do when winter finally stops, insisting on itself reclaiming color. In small increments, the willows along the creek going amber-green at the tips, the south-facing hillsides showing patches of bare earth that steamed faintly in the afternoon warmth. Ice still held in the shadows in the deep cuts under the north-facing overhangs. But the direction of things was no longer in question. She thought briefly about Solomon Kraft writing his notebook in this same firelight 30 years before the same walls around him. She thought about Fletcher Vane on that autumn afternoon, pressing the carved owl into her hand with the patience of a man who understood he was giving her something she'd need before she knew she'd need it. She thought about Rup Aldane carrying 30 years of not knowing until a single afternoon in March resolved it into something he could set down and walk away from lighter. None of them had defeated winter. That was not what had happened here. Winter was not a thing you defeated. It was a condition you accounted for accurately, without sentimentality, with the full application of everything you'd been taught, and everything you'd learned, and everything you'd had the discipline to write down so the forgetting couldn't happen at the wrong moment. The knowledge moved between people who would never meet, carried in objects and notebooks, and small carved birds threading forward through time, in the invisible way that the most important inheritances moved not handed directly from one person to the next, but placed somewhere it could be found by whoever needed it. She had needed all of it. Every piece had arrived. The owl was in her pocket. She took it out, held it in the firelight, turned it once in her fingers. The grain of the pine caught the light differently depending on the angle, which was what wood did, what everything did, if you looked at it from enough positions over enough time. She put it back. The fire settled into its coals. Cinder shifted against her leg and pressed closer in his sleep, perfectly warm, perfectly certain of exactly where he was and that it was where he was supposed to be. The cottonwood stood outside in the April dark, as it had stood through every kind of weather this valley had produced for longer than anyone had been keeping track. It had outlasted the trapper who first sheltered in it. It had outlasted the child who knocked on its door in a blizzard. It would outlast Hazel, too, eventually, the way ancient things outlast the people who find uses for them. What it could not outlast was what those people left behind in it. The record on the board, the repaired door, the clay-lined chimney that finally drew clean the small carved owl that would be given away and given away again, as long as there was someone left who understood what it meant to look at a dead tree and see something other than an ending. The fire gave back the last of its heat in the slow way of good coals reliable, past the point of expecting reliability, asking nothing, offering everything it still had.